Good day, everyone. The Society of Actuaries is pleased to present this webcast, Building an Inclusive LGBTQ Workplace, sponsored by the Society of Actuaries and Casualty Actuarial Society. We are pleased to welcome all of you to this program. My name is Rebecca, and I will be your host for today's webcast. Please note that today's call is being recorded and all participant lines will be muted during this broadcast. If you are listening to the program over the phone and you need assistance at any time today, please press *0 and an operator will assist you. Today's presentation will last up to 60 minutes and includes a specific question and answer period. However, you can queue up a question for us at any time during the presentation. You may submit a question by typing it into the box in the lower left corner of the screen. Then be sure to click on the send button located next to the box. If you are listening to the audio only and do not have access to the chat box, you may submit a question to soa@compartners.com. These instructions will be repeated later in the program. In addition, I would like to draw everyone's attention to the links box located to the left of the slide. To view or print the presentation slides, just click once on the presentation handout link and a separate web browser window will open to display the information and allow you to print it. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Jeff Drzgowski, who will introduce today's speakers. Please go ahead, Jeff.
Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to be joining everyone today and moderating this session. I did want to take a couple minutes to introduce the speakers that we have joining us today for this session. I'll start with Steve Armstrong. Steve is a well-rounded personal insurance expert with 25 years of extensive experience in pricing and product design, underwriting, and regulatory work. Steve has led teams of actuaries, predictive modelers, and product analysts throughout his career. Steve started his career at Allstate Insurance Company, where he worked as an actuary overseeing actuarial and analytical talent for auto and homeowners insurance. Steve was responsible for introducing the product and rating algorithm for DriveWise, Allstate's usage-based insurance endeavor, before he left in 2012. Between 2012 and 2017, Steve worked for two large global insurance companies, AIG and QBE, to help bring pricing sophistication and actuarial best practices to these companies and to other countries around the world. Steve has recently returned to Allstate to oversee actuarial work and lead actuarial pricing strategy for private passenger automobile. Steve received his Bachelor of Science degree in Actuarial Science from the University of Illinois in 1992 and his MBA from the University of Illinois Chicago in 2003. Steve received his Fellowship of the Casualty Actuarial Society designation in 1996. Steve has also served on the Casualty Actuarial Society Board of Directors and as the Vice President for Admissions to the Casualty Actuarial Society. Heather Schott is also joining us from the Principal today. Heather is the Assistant Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Principal. She has been with the Principal Financial Group for over 20 years. Heather is responsible for driving the diversity and inclusion strategy and initiatives for Principal's global population. Her brand and leadership style is foundational in influence, innovation, and disruption. She draws from her initial 17 years where she held a variety of roles within the IT community. In these roles, she worked across business units supporting product development, accounting, actuarial, operational functions, and driving data management practices. She is a Minnesota native. Heather received her undergraduate degrees, Bachelor of Science in Mathematics and Business, with an emphasis on management from Morningside College in Sioux City, Iowa. Heather is currently a member of the Conference Board, Diversity and Inclusion Leaders 2 Group, and the Greater Des Moines Partnership Diversity and Inclusion Council. Ron Gephardt-Bauer heads the Actuarial Science program at the Smeal College of Business. He was awarded the Fred Brand Jr. Teacher of the Year Award in 2012. Prior to joining Smeal, Ron was the Senior Benefits Advisor to the Chairman of the U.S. Senate Committee on Finance. Prior to that, he was the Senior Pension Fellow and spokesperson for the actuarial profession in the U.S. at the American Academy of Actuaries in Washington, D.C., where he frequently appeared on TV, radio, and in newsprint. He's testified before Congress and moderated the White House Conference on Social Security. In the mid-1990s, he was the head of the retirement practice at the New York City office of William Mercer, Inc. His public sector experience includes chief actuary of the Federal Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation and lead pension actuary at the Office of Personnel Management. He also was an associate actuary at Acacia Mutual Life Insurance Company in Washington, D.C. Internationally, Ron has advised the governments of Canada, Bulgaria, Vietnam, Romania, Poland, and the United Kingdom. He was the lead U.S. delegate to the International Association of Actuaries and a longtime member of the U.S. pension delegation to the OECD in Paris. And I'm Jeff Drzegalski. I am your moderator. I am a vice president in Aetna's corporate actuarial department, where I serve as the valuation actuary. I'm responsible for the determination of Aetna's actuarial liabilities at both the corporate and statutory entity level. I also oversee the MLR modeling organization. I came up through Aetna's actuarial leadership development program, and through my career at Aetna, I have had a broad exposure to the pricing, underwriting, and finance organizations across the commercial and government businesses. I also serve in a number of leadership capacities with the Society of Actuaries. I currently serve as the chair of the SOA and Casualty Actuarial Society's Joint Committee on Career Encouragement and Actuarial Diversity. I have served as an examination chair for the SOA's fellowship exams and as part of the SOA's board's nominating committee. I attained my bachelor's degree from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and I'm a fellow of the Society of Actuaries and a member of the American Academy of Actuaries. And for everyone who's following along, the College World Series is going on, and I believe the Tar Heels are playing later today. But I'm going to go ahead and get started with the content for our presentation. The first thing we did want to do is start off with a polling question to just get a sense for what our audience, what's driving our audience's participation. So you'll see that poll up there, and you can go ahead and answer whichever response best applies. All right. Has the poll closed, Rebecca?
The poll is still open, but it looks like we do have responses.
Hello?
This is Lisa calling in regards to your credit card.
It looks like we have about 36% replying B, 43% replying C, and about 20% replying A.
Okay, great. Thanks for all that input. I think that's definitely going to be helpful for us to adjust our responses and how we approach this conversation today. I did want to start off by just asking Ron. Ron, you've had a very varied and distinguished career as an actuary. I was wondering if you could talk about how you've experienced it as a gay actuary.
Hey, thanks, Jeff. So what we decided, we first would talk about a little bit of a brief history to give you a little context. Basically what I'm going to talk about is that things were pretty difficult if you go back to the 60s and 70s when I first started working. And my students and maybe young actuaries in their 20s wouldn't know this. But now things are much better. But I guess we can talk about that and debate that a little bit later too, but it's much better than it used to be. So on the first slide, I got these great pictures from Olga Jacobs, and it gives you a little bit of an understanding of what things were like back in the 60s and 70s. There's a lot of demonstrations because this was a difficult issue, and maybe you've heard the words, it was the love that dare not speak its name. There were actually newspapers that had rules, most newspapers had rules saying you couldn't even print articles about this, or you couldn't use the word gay or lesbian in the newspaper. And back then you could be fired, you could be kicked out of your apartment, you could be arrested even for assembly. And in fact, a very famous one is in New York City. You know, you think New York City is liberal, but there was the Stonewall Inn restaurant and bar. In 1969, there were riots there because the police were arresting the gay men, lesbians, and drag queens, and so there was a demonstration. Finally, we were going to fight back. So that's the sort of the outside view of things. For me, I chose the actuarial profession because I love math, and I didn't sort of have everything figured out during the 70s. You know, back when all my male friends were starting to talk about girls, I didn't understand that, and I just thought it was different, didn't figure out what it was. Maybe I was asexual, maybe I love math so much. I was a math sexual, I love math. But hadn't figured things out. So that wasn't until my 20s. And so actually not only did I love math, that was one reason I went into the actuarial profession, but also the exams were sort of a good thing for me. Whenever anybody asked why was I not dating, I said, well, I've got to pass all these exams first. Well, I finally passed all the exams, and my minister said, so why aren't you dating now? And so that really threatened me. And a few months later, I finally came out to myself as gay in 1979, and that was when I was 27. So I think that's a lot later than most people come out now. So I denied it for like 15 years and just wouldn't even deal with it. So I was closeted at work. No one knew. I would be afraid that someone would find out. I would be afraid that I'd be fired, you know, as there were no protections. So even though I was closeted at work, though, I helped organize the 1979 March on Washington. So that's very typical of gay men and lesbians who bifurcated their lives into two different lives. On one side, out of work, I was very out. Inside work, I was not at all, because discrimination was allowed. And of course, you couldn't even talk about these issues. So no way would there be things like benefits for domestic partners or employee groups or things like that. Marriage was illegal. But one of the things that was actually kind of good for me, and it's helping me still today, is that once I realized I was gay and came out at 27, it helped me understand the concerns of other groups like African Americans and women who've been marginalized. And I quickly found out what it was like to be sort of a second-class citizen without the protections I had before. All of a sudden, you know, I never used to worry about being fired from a job, and now I did. So that's why I had that compartmentalized life. And of course, I came out in '79 because things were getting better in the late 70s. But in the next decade, things were going to get worse. There was a backlash. So I've switched to the next slide on the 1980s. I even remember that Newsweek issue. I was getting Newsweek, and we were so happy to see it. But you can see not only was there a backlash, but AIDS became a very big issue, not only for us individually, but also for the insurance industry. So AIDS forced a lot of us gay men and also lesbians out of the closet because we were fighting for our lives, and we did some really good things. We fought for drug protocols that allowed companies to bring out drugs, even though they weren't fully tested, as long as they were partially tested, as long as maybe the thing they were curing was worse, like death. Insurers at this time were legitimately concerned about the impact of AIDS on their bottom line, their finances, and insurance companies were accused of redlining. But there were also good things, like viaticals came out. A viatical is something where someone who has a life insurance policy could convert it into cash, which is what they needed if they had AIDS and needed to buy drugs and procedures. And you would get more than your cash value from the insurance company. You'd have a third party who, if you could show that you might die in the next year or two, they would give you maybe the present value of your death benefit minus maybe premiums or something. It's an actuarial calculation. So actuaries became quite educated about this issue. In fact, a good friend of mine was the head of the National gay, lesbian, bisexual organization, and I got him to speak at at the annual Society of Actuaries meeting. So not only were other gay men coming out, but I was too. I actually wrote an article in Transactions, not an article, but a response to a paper an actuary had written. I think he was a former president of the society, and he wrote about how AIDS would spread, and so this was a big concern for insurance companies. So by putting in my article, I guess I was starting to come out. The Transactions were where we put papers, like the North American Actuarial Journal now. In addition, I wrote letters into my Penn State alumni magazine, letters to the editor, supporting a gay professor, that he should not be fired, that kind of stuff. And didn't realize it, but that brought me out of the closet, not only to Penn State alumni, but it also brought me out to my boss, who I didn't realize it, but he was also a Penn State alumni. Who knew? But luckily he was a good guy, and he didn't really say much to me other than I guess kind of knew. He congratulated me on my article, and I guess enough that I knew he wasn't going to fire me. Plus, I was in the government, even though I was pretty high up. I was the chief actuary of the PBGC at the time. He was sort of the number one civil servant at the PBGC, and so I was feeling comfortable. Plus, it was the federal government, which is pretty progressive. We didn't have any formal protections at that point, but we were moving in that direction, and I think courts probably would have sided with me if they had tried to fire me over something that didn't impact my work. So let's see, next slide. Yeah, so then in between the last slide and this slide is the first decade of this millennium. And again, there was another backlash. A lot of states started passing punitive laws prohibiting marriage or adoption by lesbian, gay, and bisexual couples. But also, deep underneath, there was this undercurrent, this growing undercurrent of positive reforms in some states, and people who knew someone else who was lesbian, gay, or bisexual. And eventually, it got to, I think, a point of where it was a majority. And so that's why now, all of a sudden, this decade, things are really moving fast. So, for example, whereas way back in the 60s and 70s, you would never see an article on LGBT issues. Now, the issues are in the paper constantly, and in fact, amazingly, transgender issues have already really moved quickly to acceptance. So, like my church, for example, we led a period of time of research and thinking about what we should do as a church, and we finally decided to create a statement that said transgender people were welcome. In the 1990s, that would have been a very difficult thing for us to do. In fact, even the national gay lesbian lobbies were afraid of including transgenders because that was just something that people weren't educated about. And now we are, and I think we're able to move ahead. And so now, even though the word homosexual is not used as much in the newspapers, now you'll see the word gay or lesbian. And in fact, you'll now see LGBTQA, maybe even a plus sign on there. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, maybe A for an ally, and then they put a plus on the end because, it's ongoing. We don't know, maybe there'll be more letters in the future. In addition, the brave Supreme Court ruled that it was illegal under the Constitution to discriminate on marriage. So now gay men and lesbians and bisexuals can marry someone of the same gender. Of course, it was the Supreme Court that did that. It was not passed as legislation from Congress. So, if you wait for Congress, it's still going to take time, and so we can actually still be fired and kicked out. A lot of people don't know that, but here in my own state, in Pennsylvania, I'm now a professor at Penn State, but the story is now you could be married on Sunday and then fired on Monday. Now, Penn State wouldn't do it, but maybe my spouse, if my spouse was working at a place where he had to be closeted, he could get fired. So a lot of people are still careful And so, for example, what should a company do, an insurance company, if they, a lot of companies maybe provided benefits for domestic partners. Now they might be thinking because of the Supreme Court decision they don't have to do that anymore. They can just, since everybody can get married, just limit it to just married people. But because of that issue I mentioned earlier, that you can still be fired if you're gay, your spouse can be fired. Penn State and other places are still allowing, they're still keeping benefits for domestic partners on a case-by-case basis. And I'm proud to say I think the insurance industry is pretty good on non-discrimination hiring. I think the insurance industry and consulting firms and actuaries and government, I think we're all experiencing, the industry has moved from private tolerance to maybe more public acceptance, in many cases support and inclusion. So I think, and I'll be interested in hearing what everybody else thinks, so that I think things are much better than they used to be. Let's see, what else did I want to mention? So things aren't perfect. So as I mentioned, you can still be fired. Transgender people got into the military under the last administration, but now the current administration is hinting that maybe they'll kick them out. So things are still not perfect. And one thing I like to quote is Martin Luther King Jr. said, "The arc of history may be long, but it bends towards justice." And so that sort of helps me feel that maybe we're going through one of the arc of history being long. We're going through that long part right now, but I do believe justice will prevail in my lifetime. So that's just the quick history that I had. And so I'll turn to the next slide. And Jeff, did you want to say something before this slide?
No. I was just going to say we did have thank you, Ron. We did have another poll question for the audience. I think what we wanted to do is ask the LGBTQ members of the audience, what is the best way to describe how open you are at work? You can see the choices there, A, B, C, D. Not open to anyone, open to peers, open to managers, open to all. We'll give you a couple seconds to respond there.
And it looks like the responses are coming in, that we have about 86% that are open to all, and then about 14% that are open to peers.
Great. And so on the next slide there, Ron, one of the things that we did want to spend some time talking about is what is the value of creating a workforce that people in the LGBTQ community can feel that they can be open about who they are and what their life is like and what's going on in their personal life. One of the things that the Human Rights Campaign published a few years ago was just some of the responses you get from people in the LGBTQ community who feel as though they're in an unwelcome work environment. And you can see a lot of things that I don't think any of us would really want to see going on at our workplace, where you have a portion of your population that feels this way. And you can also ultimately get to the point where people are starting to leave your company, and you could start losing productive people who are contributing meaningfully to your company just because of the work environment that you're creating for those people. And so I wanted to ask our panelists, why should employers want to focus on creating an open and inclusive workplace, and what are the values added for the business? And Heather, maybe we'll start with you.
Heather, your phone line may be on mute.
Great. Thank you for helping me with that. I did have you on mute. So as you can imagine, those in my room, which is by myself, were thoroughly amused. So I wanted to share a little bit about innovation and performance. I too, like Ron, when I started out my career, did not ever expect to out myself as part of the LGBT community. But what we've learned is that there is great value in different perspectives. And in fact, this has been scientifically proven. And clearly, it is employing me in a full-time position, even with my math background, to drive innovation from a whole different seat. So there's a great article that we've provided in the reference here on how diversity actually makes us smarter. And when I talk about us, I want to talk about the collective us. It's all of us. It's not just that we bring in diverse perspectives, but it helps those of us maybe that can't check all the boxes be more prepared, because we now have a perception by adding diversity to our group that people don't think just like we do. And there's value in that. There's value in bringing that collective intelligence that brings in and drives us to solve problems more in the complex realms by bringing those perspectives in. So I want to be clear, right? When you look at diversity, sometimes it's hard to get people from different backgrounds to come together and communicate, to interact, and to build teams. So the easy thing to do would be to build a team of folks just like you. But the reality is you're going to solve problems the way that you've always solved those problems. And I'm not sure what kind of challenges you are facing, but I know our actuaries here at Principal are facing some big challenges to make sure we remain competitive. So we can't do things the way we've always done it. And so the value of bringing those diverse perspectives, those different mindsets together, will actually drive to better outcomes. And so I want to give you a real simple example here, and I know this isn't related to the actuarial community, but think about the Coca-Cola machines. If anybody's used them, they're called Freestyles. But they offer 130 different flavors, right? I'm sure the first group that sat down to design this or threw the challenge out that 6 flavors don't fit in that 2 by 3 foot area, I'm sure when they threw that idea out, no one thought that they would really be able to deliver 130 perspectives, because they would have had a room full of engineers who have designed these machines for years. But what Coca-Cola did here in a smart way is they brought individuals from different backgrounds, perspectives, even disciplines, sitting at the table to say, you know what, we need to offer more solutions to this. And diversity in that perspective, that creativity that comes in that team, allows you to solve the problems differently. So next time as you're using one of these freestyle machines where you punch it in, think about this actually being a value add from a diversity perspective, and hopefully it'll have you have more patience when those machines break down, because they seem to. That's the IT side in me to tell you that story. I also wanted to call out, too, that you have to have diversity in both how we see or how we experience the world. So the perspectives that I would say, think about an iceberg, the things on an iceberg or the iceberg above the line are the things that we see. So whether somebody's from maybe a different race or a different culture, maybe their English isn't as clear as you interact with them, or whatever language is your first language, right? There are certain things that you can see. But the value add comes from both things that we see and things that we can't see. So thinking about experiences underneath the water or underneath the iceberg, and you can think about the Titanic, right? It wasn't the iceberg above the water that took the ship down. It was what was going on underneath. And so we know the iceberg is much bigger with underneath, but you have to have value add from both to really drive that creativity. So if we can, let's go ahead and advance the slides. And Steve, I'll turn it over to you for a moment.
All right. Thank you, Heather. Yeah, again, in trying to answer the question of why or what value does focusing on inclusive diversity, and in particular the LGBT community, have on companies, I found 2 sources that could actually help answer this question from a company perspective. Earlier this spring, there was a fantastic new survey conducted jointly by OutNext and PricewaterhouseCoopers called Out to Succeed, Realizing the Full Potential of LGBT+ Talent. That points to what inclusion can do for a company. So there's 4 points here. The first point is that inclusion can provide access to a $5 trillion market, which is the estimated global spending power of LGBT+ consumers. And adding to this, if we include the LGBT+ allies into this equation, the market grows substantially bigger by multiples of 8 or 10. The second point this survey makes is that inclusive companies can act as a brand influencer. The survey states that 78% of LGBT+ people and their friends and families would switch brands that are known to be LGBT+ friendly. allies, again, can play a very important role and an influential component in brand influence. The third point this survey makes is that inclusive companies attract talent. It goes on to say that more than 80% of LGBT+ and non-LGBT+ millennials say that an employer's policy on diversity, equality, and workforce inclusion are an important factor when deciding to work for them. And lastly, inclusion can boost a company's share performance. The Workplace Equality Index, which measures the share performance of corporations that support fairness and equality for LGBT+ employees, has actually outperformed the S&P 500 index return in the 10 years leading up to 2016. The Harvard Business Review article entitled LGBT Inclusive Companies Are Better at Three Big Things tells a similar story. The three big things noted by the researchers at Harvard Business Review are, number one, that these companies attract and retain top talent better. Number two, that they win the business and loyalty of those discerning customers. And number three, that they harness the insights of LGBT members to drive market innovation. And so with that, I'd like to turn it back to Heather for some more commentary.
Great. If you'd go ahead and advance, Ron. So the next conversation that generally comes with these efforts is, what's the business case? And so you heard in my bio that I'm known for disruption. I think that's the value add that I bring to organizations. So my first question is always, what's the business case against it? And so what you'll find in the pause after you ask that question is there really isn't a relevant business case. But in case you needed more, we have gone back to another study with McKinsey. And McKinsey actually has done this study twice, so I'll give you both references below. And it really shows that diversity does bring and show financial performance increases. In fact, gender diversity in companies, so this is in senior levels of company management, if you have that gender diversity, you're 21% more likely to outperform your competitors. If you have ethnic diversity in your senior leaders, you will see that as a 33% more likely value to outperform your customers. I actually do know this from the actuarial group. You're betting folks, right? So you're with me on, I would absolutely be considering that with my investments, right? So what we also know about the stats from the underlying survey that McKinsey did is when you see that diversity in your senior levels of organizations, you see that filter all the way through organizations. So if you're not there, this is a great business case to help your organizations understand the value. I would say that this would translate into LGBT diversity too in senior leaderships. That is not tracked as readily or as easily, and that is mainly because our U.S. government right now at least does not require us to provide that, but we do believe down the road that will be a requirement, that will be something else that is part of the affirmative action EEO. So I also wanted to share this interesting linear stat. I'd like to use this stat here in my conversations internally to talk a little bit about, look, if we can increase ethnic diversity in our senior leaderships, we know that the performance, every 10% that we do that, the performance gives us a 0.8% return. And I like to joke internally that, hey, just 10, 20% for us funds diversity and inclusion for the rest of my career until retirement. I know I'm about 15 years away. I wish you were all in the same room with me so you could laugh with me on this one, that this is really our goal. It's really driving that change and driving those numbers for profit companies up. So go ahead and advance, Steve, and I'll turn it back over to you.
I think we're going to come back to me, Heather, but that's awesome.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you both. I'll be coming back to you in just a second. We did want to ask another poll question. This one's sort of getting at how you feel about your workplace and how you feel your workplace is in terms of making LGBTQ employees comfortable with being open about who they are. Your choices here are unwelcoming, about evenly split between welcoming and unwelcoming, and welcoming. And I'll give you some time to respond there.
And we're showing about a third of people find that their companies are evenly split between welcoming and unwelcoming, and then a majority of people are finding their companies welcoming.
Okay. Well, that's always a great stat to hear. I think the one thing, and the one thing we wanted to get to in this presentation was how can companies build an open and inclusive workplace, and specifically for the LGBTQ community. And Heather, I was going to ask you to start us off here.
Yeah, absolutely. What we want to do is we want to share the tools and the techniques that we use within organizations. And so diversity and inclusion, advancing this, is actually critical for all of us to do at once, right? So we can work really hard internal in our organizations and we can get great results, but it really won't matter if you can't get that same effect outside your walls, right? So within diversity and inclusion, we encourage you to leverage each other's tools in the training. So I'm going to share with you what we do. We really believe that you can't start any conversations around diversity and inclusion without actually building a foundation of trust. And so to do this, we actually have come up with 5 what we call verbal contracts that we start off every single session with. And it really starts from a place of being humans. We're all humans. We know that business case is there, but sometimes we don't know how to fix it. And in order to fix that, we have to actually have a civil dialogue. And so we use these 5 pieces. One is assume good intent. Look for those teachable moments. Because guess what? We all make mistakes. I lead diversity and inclusion, and I make mistakes every day. And I hope those around me will teach me when I make those mistakes. That second piece is we're human. So when those mistakes happen, what are we going to do? We're going to agree to apologize, forgive, fix it, and move it forward. There's a difference between really not being aware and not knowing making a mistake and somebody who's repeating it, right? And that difference is really called out here, that we're here to help each other and to remember that we're all humans. The middle piece we leverage, too, is all about the judgment-free zone. See, I am a huge Cy Wakeman fan, and when it comes to leadership, we know that when you start judging, you stop leading. And so we teach our individuals to come into these conversations without judgment, and understanding, though, that tone does matter. So we ask people to ask questions from a place of curiosity, from a place of what if. So we leverage different questions that allow us to go deeper in the conversations. With diversity and inclusion, we drive conversations from a learning perspective. So we do ask folks to listen and learn. Education is the goal of our sessions. And what we do know is that you're going to learn more if you quit talking and actually listen. So we bring that up and we start these conversations from that perspective. And then the last piece is something we all should do. Whether it's in diversity and inclusion or new business strategies, we've all got to get comfortable in the uncomfortable. We're not going to have every answer every single time, and that's okay. But what we do have to have is the right attitude and the right spirit to drive that forward. So this contract was actually created in collaboration with somebody named Donna Redwing. And I think across the country, you'll recognize her name, and if you don't, go ahead and Google her. But she's an amazing advocate in our LGBT community who spent the end of her career and the rest of her life, her life ended earlier this year. And I had the amazing experience to work with this Shiro. She really drove change in how we hold conversations in the LGBT community. She drove change throughout the country on different pieces. But civil dialogue was her thing. She reached out directly to an anti-LGBT individual here in the state of Iowa who was campaigning really hard to move us away from being an inclusive state. And what was so amazing about this is that she reached out to him and said, you know what, let's have coffee. Let's get to know each other as human beings. And when we think about this trust foundation here, that's what they put in place, something very similar to this. To say, we're going to come together, we're going to get to know each other as human beings, which is what I would encourage you to do in your organizations when you start diversity and inclusion practices. And learn that there are going to be pieces that we really enjoy about each other, even when there are differences. What I'll leave you with this topic is, if you Google her, you'll actually see that they had some pretty amazing conversations. And as I attended her celebration of life, this advocate who was anti-LGBT actually came and spoke and it was very moving to see how this had changed his perspective. So this is the kind of a piece of, don't give up even in those tough moments. Start from that place of trust, start from that place of we're all humans to come together. But feel free to leverage a tool like this as you move forward. If you can, go ahead and advance the slide. So at Principal, we leverage that foundation of trust to really explore what it's like to be human. I'm not sure if you have to advance it one more time. It seems like it's not popping all the way up. But we'll use 5 different strategies to do that. The first piece is storytelling. It really starts with you. We all have a story, and through that foundation of trust, we're able to share that with each other. Again, we do this through something called connected conversations. You can do this through listening sessions, whatever it might be, to really drive those conversations and that learning as you move topics forward in your organization, specifically around LGBTQ. As Ron shared earlier, there are other acronyms, right, that are added on there. We choose to say LGBT+ at Principal because we know those other acronyms are there and coming. But through the storytelling and education, then we're able to go deeper and honor and share the labels that individuals decide to choose for themselves, because that's really the way that you need to manage these pieces of that. And then we do focus. We spend time. We don't pause to think that we are a for-profit company, and we understand that our customers are also LGBT+ individuals, and so we want to understand their impact. And sometimes you'll notice as you come together on a mission, which is for us, helping people live their best lives, that means that we need to look at it from the perspective or the understanding of that customer. And so we do spend time talking about the customer impacts of these stories in that education sessions. And we encourage those that are part of our work community to become part of our local communities, wherever we would be. Again, we're in 19 countries throughout this world, and we want to make sure that the communities that we operate in are just as successful, and so we are reaching outside our walls. As we do that, one way we're doing that is me being involved in this committee and in this conversation to make sure that we're driving, we're helping move initiatives forward. So if you can go ahead and advance. So one thing that we've learned is that when teams feel included, their team performance actually increases by 50%. That is from the Science of Inclusion, How We Can Leverage the Brain to Build Smarter Teams by Cox, Davis, Rock, Ingrid, and Grant. That is an amazing stat for me to use with our organization. And so we've tried to do that through some learning specifically around empathy. So we truly talk about what it's like to be empathetic, not sympathetic, right? So understanding and using awareness through our customer-first approach. So we look through their lens or the different lenses. We encourage curiosity, so we ask the questions, the disruptive questions, about what customers might want and need, and employees. So being in HR, my customers are my employees, and so I think about it from their perspective. What's it like to actually experience a company from these different perspectives? And we seek, and we are not perfect, no organization is, but we seek to treat people the way they want to be treated, the way you want to be treated when you interact with us. So there's the tools, and that's the foundation where we have started. As the organization, you can see in these conversations, we leverage things like listen and learn to make sure that we're truly building, but we always come back to that foundation of trust. So, Steve, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk a little bit about what you're doing.
Sure, thank you. So I'm going to put my Allstate hat on now and speak a little bit about the company that has provided me such a great career as a gay actuary. First and foremost, in terms of broader inclusive diversity, it really all does start at the top. And at Allstate, inclusive diversity is explicitly singled out as one of Allstate's core values. And the statement I'd like to read out loud, even though it's printed on the slide here, is pretty compelling because at Allstate, we are actively seeking out and leveraging the collective mixture of individual differences and similarities because that improves business outcomes for our workforce, for the marketplace, and our local communities. And this ranges from characteristics such as age, gender, race, sexual orientation, disabilities, etc., to the values and beliefs, whether those be religious, attitudinal, lifestyles, political views, etc., along with our backgrounds and experiences, which can be personal, educational, functional, etc. It's also of note to say that annually, Allstate requires each of its major operating units to develop a set of inclusive diversity commitments. Allstate also has what's called an Enterprise Diversity Leadership Council that acts as a catalyst and an amplifier for opportunities that advance inclusive diversity at Allstate. And Allstate also has 11 employee resource groups, also known as ERGs, that thousands of Allstate employees belong to with various chapters all across the country. And lastly, Allstate has a specific inclusive diversity team located in human resources, many of whom have been helpful in helping me prepare for this particular webcast. Can we advance the slide, please? Yeah, Allstate is being recognized for its diversity efforts also by a number of leading publications. Just in 2018, Allstate was included on the Diversity Inc. Top 50 Companies for Diversity for the 13th consecutive year, and for the first time in 2018, it was named the best place to work for LGBTQ equality. Walking through the numbers on this slide, I just wanted to show you that we at Allstate protect about 16 million households. We have 11 resource groups, Pride being one of them that I'm going to talk about more specifically here in a moment. We have over 7,000 Allstate employees who are involved among those 11 ERGs. And since the early 50s, the Allstate Foundation, Allstate, its employees, and its agency owners have invested over more than $400 million in funding across the country to address key social issues. For example, Allstate has a deep relationship with the National LGBT Chamber of Commerce, also known as the NGLCC, which, for those who don't know, is the business voice of the LGBT community and the largest advocacy organization dedicated to expanding economic opportunities and advancements for LGBT people, and the exclusive certifying body for LGBT-owned businesses. And the last number on this slide before we advance it is that we have over 1,000 members of Allstate Pride. So the next slide, please. Yeah, at Allstate, our employee resource group called Pride has one singular purpose, and that purpose is to be a resource group for Allstate's LGBT community, our LGBT plus community, and its allies as a space to do three things. One, to increase awareness, education, and advocacy within the workplace. Allstate currently has chapters in 16 different states. A recent example of how Allstate's business units and Pride have worked together is to explore the rating and underwriting implications being posed in states like Oregon and California that are moving to a non-binary system in self-identifying one's sex on their driver's license. So for anybody who's priced auto insurance, you know that gender is usually a variable that goes into the calculation of one's premium. And now that California and Oregon are having a third variable that's not male or female as part of the underwriting system, Allstate and Pride members have a chance to work together to inform the best approach that Allstate can take in providing that opportunity to follow the law there in those states. Talking a bit more about Pride also, Pride members have helped create gender-neutral talk paths for agents to use when discussing policy options with our customers. And Pride members have also helped Allstate in fostering an environment for employees to optionally self-select their preferred gender. And lastly, Allstate Pride also brings in outside speakers, for example, like Eric Alva, who was one of the first Marines to be seriously injured in the Iraq War and who also played a key and instrumental part in repealing the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policies. So these are just a minor few, not minor, but just a few examples, rather, of how Pride is meeting its purpose to increase awareness, education, and advocacy in the workplace. Next slide, please. Much like Heather's 5 verbal commitment contract from an earlier slide, Allstate also has something called the Inclusive Diversity Pledge that it encourages all employees to sign. And you can read it here in front of you, but it mentions that by signing this pledge that you're going to acknowledge, understand, and care about the experiences of others through both your words and actions, that you'll use your voice to advocate for inclusive diversity and speak up for others, that you'll actively promote a culture of openness and inclusion within your team, that you'll consider the value of diverse backgrounds and ideas when forming teams, that you'll build your own capability to be more inclusive with different education whenever possible, and that you'll hold yourself and others accountable for intentionally being an inclusive leader. So hopefully between what Heather discussed at Principal and what I discussed here at Allstate, you might be more well-equipped to take some ideas back to your companies and investigate how we can all leverage the power of inclusive diversity. I'll now turn it back over to Jeff.
Thanks, Steve. So we do have another poll question here. We did want to see what the audience's opinion was of the actuarial profession and whether or not they see barriers to entry for members of the LGBTQ community. So we'll give you a couple seconds here to respond.
And it looks like the majority, or it looks like everyone is responding. Oh, it looks like we have 94% responding no, and 6% responding yes.
Okay. So again, a good sign. One thing I did, Ron, with you being on the panel here and your involvement at Penn State, I wanted to get some perspective from you about how you see students viewing the actuarial profession. And how what do they view it from the LGBTQ perspective as well?
Thanks, Jeff. Actually, that poll just showed me that my students kind of line up with the people who are attending this webcast. Yeah, my students, this whole new generation in college, they're way ahead of my generation. I have an interesting story that I like to tell. We have a lot of Chinese students from China. And I was really proud of my students when we had the elections for the president of the Actuarial Science Club, and they elected him. A lot of the U.S. students just thought that was great, and they voted for the Chinese student. And it was a year later when I found out not only was he Chinese, but I also found out he was gay. And they knew it back then, and that's another reason they voted for him. So, yeah, our students are way ahead, which is great. So I asked some of my students, including that president of the Actuarial Science Club, who got a great job at an insurance company, what did they think about the industry, and what did they do in getting a job? And they did their research. They before they got further interested in a company, they checked to see if the company had a diversity program. Were they ranked as one of the best places to work that was mentioned earlier by the Human Rights Campaign? Do they have an LGBT plus employee resource group? Some of them said they would not apply if they didn't see explicit rules on non-discrimination. In fact, I think they wanted more than just boilerplate language that you're supposed to have there. They wanted to see in all sorts of ways that the company was welcoming. And one student said he wasn't going to work at a place that wasn't that wasn't welcoming. And it was his most important criteria. And just like the people in the poll, they didn't see barriers. And I've talked to them since they've worked at their companies, and yeah, they're very happy, not only with the industry, but also the profession as an actuary. And I think they also feel the actuarial profession is welcoming, and maybe it's because some of the thoughts they had was, well, inclusion is maybe correlated well with education. So our profession is a very educated profession. We're often math majors, so we're very logical, and that just seems to fit in. Also, advancement is based on passing exams. It's not subjective, or not as subjective as other professions or other jobs. And I guess they see all our employers as being progressive. For sure in the academic world it's very progressive. I also worked, as you probably heard earlier, in the federal government, and it's generally, even if Congress isn't as progressive or the administration isn't as progressive, the workforce is pretty progressive, not only in the federal government but also in most states. And then the insurance industry and consulting, I think they're seen as fairly progressive. If you go, one thing I talk about in my class, if you go way back to the past, our industry started out from the sea towns around England, where people would go out in ships, come back with gold and spices, and everybody'd be rich. But if they didn't come back, you had a lot of widows and orphans, and the town would band together to help them out. And so I think that's where our insurance industry starts, is sort of group solutions, banding together and helping everybody out. And this is not a perfect thing, because, as we've come through the last few centuries, we've learned we have to be careful, and sometimes we do have to underwrite and discriminate between people. But sometimes the laws say, well, you can't discriminate on the basis of this or this in certain areas. The other thing I really enjoy hearing from my students when they come back to me after work, and they tell me if they do work in the spin-off merger and acquisition area or in reinsurance work, that they work with the other companies, their counterparties, actuaries, to make sure that the other party has good data on their employees or whatever. So, I think there's a lot of pride in our profession that we are doing what's best for our counterparty or for our client. Like when I was a pension actuary, we were close to being fiduciaries, and so our motive is to do what's best for our client, which is different than other majors. Maybe they go to work at Wall Street, and caveat emptor is the word there, buyer beware on Wall Street. But we're a profession. In order for a profession to survive, we've got to do something good, socially good for the world. And so we have a code of conduct. Precept 1 talks about integrity, and 7 is acting fairly without conflicts of interest. Precept 10 is on courtesy and cooperation. So I think this is a good profession, and it sounds like the audience agrees. I'll be interested in hearing what everybody thinks. So I guess maybe that's enough, because I just noticed it's 1:58, so I'll move on to the next person.
Yeah, Ron, thank you. You can advance the slide, and we're probably going to run a little bit long of the 2 o'clock hour here on the Eastern Daylight Savings Time. The one thing we did also want to touch on is, what are the CAS and the SOA doing as it relates to LGBTQ members of their community? And we did just want to throw up on the screen the diversity statements from both organizations. And as you read through them, it's pretty easy to pick out diverse, inclusive in both statements. The SOA has openness in word there, but as I read through the CAS diversity statement, there's definitely all of the same words that get you to openness. Differences are celebrated, and all have the opportunity to participate to the fullest potential. So I think these are some of the things that the two organizations are including just in their general governance of the organization. I think it'd also be helpful maybe just to get some idea about what are some of the actual actions both organizations are taking. Heather, I was wondering if that was something maybe you could talk to?
Sure, if you could advance the slide for us here. I'll talk a little bit about the outreach. In fact, maybe I'll give you a little more background on why I'm here. So as a diversity and inclusion specialist here at Principal, and ironically I have a math background, but that's not really where this comes from. We actually at Principal decided that we want to look outside our walls. We want to have that impact on the Society of Actuaries in general. So I'm committing to being part of a subcommittee where we try to bring some of our practice into the committee, into the SOA, and obviously sharing this across walls with CAS is great for us too. But we want to share these practices so that we truly can get to the open and welcoming environment. So I do believe that we are moving in the right direction, and we're seeing the signals there from both Ron's messages and from your responses to our survey. But the reality is we're not done yet. Until we really see that representation across senior leadership in organizations that are run through our actuaries, we need to keep working. And so I want to say, it's really all about maximizing that talent and the performance and getting involved. So what are we doing right now? A few different things that we're doing is making sure that sessions or programming during meetings have a focus on diversity and inclusion. And I would encourage all of you to encourage others to go. This will help you develop as a human and to be involved in understanding the different perspectives. There are absolutely social events that are planned and available to members and candidates during that gathering, and specifically around the LGBT community. Right now, I think there was a need defined and shared that work was there. You'll notice more articles in publications, and that we are joining conversations with employers and organizations like the Human Rights Campaign to talk about the civil rights of employed actuaries that are threatened. So I'll also note at this time, to remember the HB2 bill out of North Carolina. Many people think of that as the bathroom bill, and it absolutely was the bathroom bill. But the bigger impact and the reason that the SOA took a stand with this letter is that that actually got to the fact that you could terminate individuals because they were transgender, right? So being a person myself that is gender nonconforming, so I'm not transgender, but I'm absolutely in the perspective. I'll flip a tie on to share presentations and to make people a little bit uncomfortable, but because that's the way I am, I'm comfortable, right? In the state, if that law were to stay in place, right, I could be fired just because I wore a tie to work because I didn't conform, right? So that's really the work that's being done. There's some work around out in STEM that's sponsored by CAS and the SOA through joint committees on career encouragement and actuarial diversity. So students enroll in STEM programs, and we get to expose them to some of the actuarial professions. I do believe this is an honorable profession. I see the value. I here at Principal leverage this community to really vet my ideas and my thoughts to make sure if I can, I joke about if I can get it past the actuaries, right, we can get it out in the community and we'll get it past others. So it's a very involved group of individuals that are sharing their stories. And I would say watch for publications, specifically the Actuaries August and September issue. That's going to be dedicated to diversity and inclusion topics. Ron's actually going to be featured in this issue, and I look forward to reading that myself to hear and learn more about Ron's work and what he's doing. The SOA Leadership and Development section publication, The Stepping Stone, also will have a column on D&I, so watch out for those efforts. You'll notice, too, that we are doing more outreach, and so there is a group that if you are interested in, we want you to reach out and provide some feedback, but it's an LGBTQ and ally resource group that is looked to be developed. And so any listeners that are interested in forming this group or being part of this formation of the group, certainly reach out to us after this webcast. I want to emphasize, the value of allies. And I know we had a large percentage of individuals that are listening to learn. And the one thing that I would say to those individuals here that are allies is, one, just take a step and get involved. Seek to understand from others. I know you're amazing in this profession to ask the questions, to seek that understanding, but it's really the ally voice then that can articulate that message back in your networks or in your social community that really help to drive that change. So please seek out these experiences if you're interested. I think there's some amazing thing, again, an external perspective from a D&I leader. I am so excited about the efforts that are being done by these two groups. I'm very proud of you and very proud to be involved in this. So with that, Jeff, I'll turn it back over to you.
Steve, there was I think some stuff I think you wanted to also talk about there as well.
Yeah, this will be pretty brief. I just want to echo first and foremost how proud I am as well of what the SOA and the CIS are doing broadly with inclusive diversity, and in particular focusing some spotlight on the LGBT plus community as well. But I wanted to also just say, kind of as we've been discussing a lot about how LGBT plus inclusion can happen in companies, I thought it would be interesting to kind of also ask, how can it translate to organizations? And as the SOA and CIS are making headway, I thought this might be a nice cheat sheet at times to kind of revert back to try to see exactly whether or not, as actuarial organizations, we are committed to our diversity statements and our words are matching our thoughts, or our actions are matching our thoughts, pardon me. So that being said, I just wanted to cover a few other interesting tips that I take from this same survey I referenced earlier from OutNext and PricewaterhouseCoopers, because I think it's pretty profound and it's meant a lot to me. So in their survey, they provide some tips on what a company or an organization can do to support equality and open up the communal benefits of LGBT plus inclusion. And so the 5 tips on the left start by saying, set the right tone from the top. And so I would challenge both the SOA and the CIS and other actuarial organizations to kind of say, what is the president saying? What are the board of directors saying? How loudly are they saying it? What is that tone? The second tip is to create clear pathways for progression in our organizations. So when we look and ask ourselves, do we have LGBT plus volunteers and staff in high levels of leadership and influence in our respective organizations? The third one says, stand up and advocate for equality. So how much of that have we done? How much of that are we willing to do going forward in our respective organizations? The fourth tip is to build and empower ally networks. So what kind of LGBT plus and ally networks do our organizations currently have, and how might they evolve? And then the last one is to create more inclusive communications, like Heather had mentioned, is ongoing. So what kind of monthly newsletters and internet content can be considered here going forward? On the right-hand side of the slide, these are kind of questions that an organization could quote-unquote grade itself on. So they're statements actually, not questions. And with each statement, it might be appropriate for all organizations to kind of ask themselves, do they agree, partially agree, or disagree with the following 5 statements? And to the extent that you answer differently for each one of these statements, it might help you refine your diversity statement. It might refine your diversity strategy and tactics, etc. And so the 5 statements, just as simply put out there, are, number 1, our organizations and its leaderships actively advocate for LGBT plus community, or equality, pardon me. Number 2 is that LGBT plus members feel valued rather than just accepted. Would our organizations agree, partially agree, or disagree with that comment? The third one is that LGBT plus members feel empowered to bring their whole selves to work without feeling the need to either pass or cover. And I put work in quotation marks because it could mean volunteer work as well. The fourth one is that our respective organizations have visible LGBT plus mentors, role models, and allies to assure LGBT plus members that any discrimination will be challenged and that their aspirations can be met. And the last statement that I think our organizations should continuously look back on and rate themselves on is, our organizations have procedures for understanding why LGBT plus members may leave or not volunteer for duties, and how this could potentially be addressed. So just ask that maybe the boards and other leaders take this little cheat sheet out and maybe annually or biannually, whatever the case may be, just use this and kind of use it as a guidepost to kind of keep us honest and keep us on the track towards more inclusive diversity, in particular for the LGBT plus community. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Jeff for concluding comments and Q&A.
Thanks, Steve. So yeah, before we get to concluding comments, I did want to start and see if anyone has any questions. You'll be able to, in the chat window, you can type in a question if you have one, and we'll be able to raise it with the group. I do have one question now, so if you're still thinking of some or still typing some in, you'll have a couple seconds there or a couple minutes to get those typed in. I think, Steve, I was going to direct this to you because I think you actually might have just touched on it, but maybe we can put a finer point on it. One of the members of the audience was wondering if you could provide a distinction between not being discriminatory and being LGBT inclusive.
Yeah, I saw that question that was leveraged, and I think it's a really good one because I have been sitting here for 40 minutes trying to think of the best way to answer it, and I'm probably going to stumble clumsily trying to answer it. But I'm not, I guess I would almost start to say there really isn't a tremendous distinction. So I think the LGBT inclusivity really just means, to me, if you're is listening, advocating, finding opportunities, mentoring, etc. I find that to be kind of LGBT inclusive. Not being discriminatory, again, literally just means that I'm fundamentally doing something when I know that there might be an LGBT member or volunteer or colleague that would be doing something that might be kind of harmful for their career or for their opportunities. So I think you want to be both non-discriminatory and inclusive, and so that's why I said it's a little bit of a challenging question. But I might phone a friend here and see if Heather or Rob might want to be able to add in their perspectives. But I also might slightly be missing something from the question in terms of some context.
Yeah, and Heather, I'm definitely interested in your thoughts on this as well. I did think, though, on that last slide where you were talking about the 5 questions you would ask, I think some of the responses there might get you to, are we being non-discriminatory but not really being an open and inclusive work environment? Heather, did you have anything you wanted to share there?
Yeah, so I would step in and say, it's the difference between living up to compliance and really maximizing the experience for someone. So think of how you feel when someone maybe follows a rule or says hello when you walk in the door versus when someone greets you with a smile and leaves you feeling included. So the value of inclusion is really allowing somebody to bring their full self to that opportunity, whether it is in their everyday work setting or their volunteer setting or whatever it might be. When you're relaxed and you're more comfortable, you're able to be creative, right? But when a company treats you like, we're going to treat you fair, you're here, you can be heard, but you're really not welcome, there's a big difference in that. And so there's actually psychology behind this where you can put a parallel to this. So think about actually having a broken arm at a moment. And the pain that you experience in that moment, if you physically have a broken arm, will not allow you to listen or interact, right? But what they've learned is the same areas trigger in your brain when you don't feel included. So next time you see someone sitting quietly in the corner, right? So we maybe, the difference here is the compliance, like we open the door, we let them walk in, they can be part of our group. But truly including and truly maximizing their value is not leaving them with that broken arm, that unseen broken arm in the corner being excluded, right? And you're not intentionally excluding them, but you're not totally welcoming them in. Does that help, Jeff? Does that
Yes.
get a little further?
Thanks, Heather. I thought that was very helpful.
What I've heard is sometimes it's the difference between being invited to the dance or dancing with somebody there and enjoying it.
Right. Whether being invited to the dance and being asked to dance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And belonging is dancing like nobody's watching, right? That's your utopia. That's where you want to get to.
Another question that came in just was asking just about the Academy's involvement on this issue. I will say that I have come here sort of from the SOA's perspective, and I know some of us are from the SOA and some are from the CAS. I don't think any of us are really representing the Academy, so I don't think that's something that any of us are really prepared to respond on. So not something that I'm overly knowledgeable about at this point.
I could say a couple things since I worked for the Academy as the Senior Pension Fellow for 12 years. I was actually hired by the American Academy of Actuaries back in 1996 when I was open and out. In fact, they knew my husband, Greg, because he always came with me to the pension committee meetings. And so they not only hired me, they actually sought me out and said, hey, you want to be the Senior Pension Fellow? And I said, yeah. So the people who work at the Academy have been great since the 90s, over 20 years ago. Officially, I don't know if the Academy has any position on it, but I'm sure knowing the people and the president and the board members that they'd be great.
Thanks, Ron. So I'm looking in the question box, and I'm not seeing any other questions coming in. So with that, I guess I will wrap up. I did want to take a second to thank Ron, Steve, and Heather for joining me and having this discussion with all of you. And I did want to thank all of you for joining us on this conversation and providing us with your responses to our poll questions. That was very insightful, and also for the questions that you've asked. I think we've had an enjoyable time doing this for everyone, and look forward to seeing and talking to everyone sometime soon. Thanks.
Thank you for your participation in today's webcast. We hope to see you here again soon. Today's program is copyright 2018 by the Society of Actuaries with all rights reserved. This concludes today's program. Thank you. You may now disconnect.